In the mid-1800s, something mysterious and unexplained swept across the Western world: the rapid rise of insane asylums. Between 1845 and 1890, massive psychiatric institutions began springing up in nearly every major city. These were not simple medical buildings but colossal stone complexes, often constructed at an almost impossible speed. These asylums filled up quickly with patients, but the records that would explain their existence remained scarce. Testimonies from the time seemed to have vanished, and many stories were dismissed as madness before they could even be heard. The official explanation for this explosion of asylums is rooted in humanitarian reform. The rise of moral treatment, industrialization creating mental strain, and the breakdown of traditional community structures are all cited as causes for the sudden need to institutionalize people. However, the true nature of this sudden psychiatric infrastructure expansion may not be as simple as the official narrative suggests. There might be another possibility, one that is never taught and remains largely ignored. Could it be that a global catastrophe occurred, one that left a hidden, erased world quietly rebranded as myth? If such an event did happen, there would surely have been survivors. People whose memories didn't fit the newly constructed official story would have had to remain hidden, their testimony discarded. The real question is whether these asylums were truly built to heal or whether their true purpose was to house those who remembered what came before, the witnesses to a world that no longer existed in the official history. At the start of the 19th century, there were only a handful of dedicated psychiatric institutions in North America, no more than a dozen. By 1880, however, the number had swelled to over 300. A similar pattern occurred in Britain, where the number of asylums surged from around 20 to more than 120 in the same period. The same trend was seen across Europe, in France, Germany, Russia, and even Italy, Spain, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all of which experienced the same dramatic increase in the construction of psychiatric institutions during the same narrow time frame. The question is, where did all these patients come from? The standard answer points to urbanization and the pressures of modern life. The rapid industrialization of cities, growing poverty, and the breakdown of traditional communities are often cited as factors contributing to the mental strain that led to the massive rise in institutionalized patients. The argument follows that industrial capitalism created new forms of social dislocation that drove people mad. The dissolution of rural communities left many vulnerable individuals without the support systems they once had. But when you examine the actual timeline of asylum construction, this narrative falls short. The boom in asylum building doesn't always correlate neatly with the rise of industrialization. In some areas, asylums were built earlier than in others, and in places with little industrial development, massive psychiatric facilities were constructed alongside those in major urban centers. Take, for example, small rural towns with populations of only 15,000 or 20,000. In these communities, towns with no factories and minimal urban density, asylums were built with the capacity to hold up to 2,000 patients. That's a massive scale, particularly when you consider that these towns had no apparent source of mass mental illness. It doesn't make sense unless the patients were coming from somewhere else, or unless something else was going on that the official records refuse to acknowledge. This brings us to a strange but important parallel timeline, one that official history ignores or treats as unrelated. Between roughly 1750 and 1850, something extraordinary and unexplained occurred to cities across the globe. Cities that had no cultural contact with one another, cities like St. Petersburg, Paris, London, Boston, and San Francisco, suddenly showed signs of rapid burial. Buildings that once had ground floor entrances were now half submerged. Street levels rose, so much so that windows that once opened to streets now opened to dirt. This phenomenon, known as the Mudflood, left evidence of entire neighborhoods that were sunk 3 to 15 feet below the surrounding streets. Buildings with ornate first-floor windows were now buried underground. Basements that were clearly designed as ground floors had ceilings too high to fit with the idea of subterranean spaces. What is strange is that cities in entirely different parts of the world, with no coordinated engineering or urban planning, displayed the same architectural evidence of this sudden disruption. There is no explanation for how or why this happened. And what's even stranger is that this event coincides exactly with the period of asylum construction. Between 1800 and 1860, when cities were being buried and street levels were rising, asylum construction exploded. If a civilization-altering event had truly occurred, if cities were buried, populations displaced, and the very landscape of the earth changed, it would make sense that there would be survivors who remembered a different world. They would be people who recalled that streets were once higher, buildings were once taller, and the architecture was different. These survivors would represent a contradiction to the newly constructed official narrative. And so, the question arises, how do you handle these witnesses, these people who refuse to accept the official timeline? How do you erase their testimony without resorting to outright violence? The answer, perhaps, is in the asylums themselves. If the world had indeed changed in a cataclysmic way, and if these survivors carried the memories of a different world, then silencing them might be a necessary part of erasing the truth. These asylums weren't just places of care. They could have been built as containment centers. They may have been designed to keep those who remembered the old world from speaking out, to separate them from the rest of society, and to ensure that their memories were lost forever. The rise of asylums, the sudden appearance of patients, the speed of asylum construction, all these factors suggest that the true purpose of these institutions may have been something far darker than simple medical reform. Perhaps the real goal was not to heal the mentally ill, but to erase the memories of those who could still remember what came before. The architecture of the psychiatric asylums constructed in the 19th century is just as enigmatic as the patients they were meant to house. These structures were not just hospitals or mental health facilities, but rather monumental fortresses, built with advanced stonework and precision. The sheer scale of these buildings raises an important question. What were these institutions really meant for? These massive complexes weren't simply designed to treat the mentally ill, they seem to have been built with a much more complex purpose in mind. Their size, symmetry, and imposing architecture suggest they were designed to contain, silence, and isolate large numbers of people, likely those who might have known too much about the world before the event that reshaped it. The Kirkbride Plan, developed in 1854 by Thomas Story Kirkbride, served as the blueprint for asylum construction in North America. This design was characterized by grand, symmetrical buildings with sprawling wings meant to house thousands of patients. The institutions were almost always made of stone and brick, with decorative stonework and ornate features that are often inconsistent with what would be expected for mental health facilities built in the mid-1800s. These buildings were not just medical structures but architectural monuments, filled with advanced features such as sophisticated ventilation systems, large windows, and ornamental details that suggested a far more intricate design than what was necessary for a mere psychiatric institution. The question arises, why such massive, meticulously designed buildings for the mentally ill? What was the purpose behind constructing these monumental structures in the first place? At the time, the mental health field was still relatively young, and the understanding of psychiatric care was rudimentary at best. So why did the asylums look so elaborate, as if they were meant to last for centuries and serve a much grander purpose than simply housing patients? Many of these asylums appeared in the historical record with little explanation of how or why they came into existence. Often, the buildings seemed to materialize suddenly, fully operational with patient populations that arrived almost immediately. There were no detailed construction records, no photos documenting their progress, and in many cases, no mention of how the buildings were financed or built. It was as if they had always existed, repurposed for this new function, built not as a response to the growing needs of mental health care, but as if they were already waiting for a purpose. This sudden appearance of fully functional psychiatric institutions, coupled with the unclear origins of their patients, raises the unsettling question of where these patients came from. The records from that time offer vague descriptions such as wandering poor, deranged, and unsound minds, but there are no clear references to specific individuals or groups of people who were being committed. The descriptions in these records seem deliberately vague, almost as if the true reasons for commitment were being obscured. The patients were not described in detail, and the language avoided specifics. This leads to the possibility that these people may have been put away not because they were mentally ill, but because they had witnessed something that the powers that be wanted to suppress. The idea that these asylums were built for another, more insidious purpose becomes even more plausible when you consider the global coordination behind their construction. These weren't isolated events in specific regions or countries. The rise of asylums happened almost simultaneously across the world. In Britain, the Lunacy Act passed in 1845 mandated the construction of asylums in every county. France passed similar legislation in the same year. States in the U.S. followed suit throughout the 1840s and 1850s, and other countries like Russia, Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire also began building psychiatric institutions at an unprecedented scale. In Japan, despite no prior tradition of psychiatry, Western-style asylums began to emerge in the 1870s. Even colonies in Africa and Asia saw the rise of asylums, often before hospitals or schools. What's more perplexing is the similarity of the asylum designs across such diverse regions. Asylums in Pennsylvania and Siberia, for instance, were constructed with almost identical architectural principles: large, imposing stone buildings with symmetrical wings and ornate details. These institutions were not merely a reflection of local needs. They were part of a worldwide plan that seemed to have been coordinated without any official documentation to prove it. This global rise in asylum construction wasn't just a response to local conditions, nor was it the result of an organic process of medical advancement. The widespread and rapid expansion of asylums points to the possibility that something more deliberate and systematic was at play. If the construction of asylums was part of a broader, coordinated effort, then what was the true motivation behind this worldwide infrastructure boom? Was it truly about providing care for the mentally ill, or was it about something much larger? The strange and imposing architecture of the asylums suggests they may have been designed as containment structures, built not to heal, but to isolate and suppress those who might remember something that could contradict the official narrative that was being constructed in the wake of a global catastrophe. Perhaps the answer lies in the nature of the patients. If the patients came from elsewhere, if they weren't simply the poor, the deranged, or the mentally ill, then what was the real purpose behind their institutionalization? The sudden rise in asylum construction, the mysterious origins of the patients, and the architectural grandeur of the buildings all suggest that the rise of asylums was about much more than treating the mentally ill. These institutions may have been designed to hide and silence those who remembered a time before the global disaster. They may have been constructed not as hospitals, but as prisons for the mind, meant to erase the memories of those who had lived through a lost world. The explosion of asylum construction during the 19th century is not only marked by architectural grandeur but also by a sudden and unsettling shift in the definition of mental illness itself. Before 1840, insanity was a relatively narrow diagnosis. It referred primarily to extreme cases of mental disturbance, violent behavior, profound cognitive impairments, or conditions so obvious that their presence could not be denied. Institutionalization, therefore, was reserved for individuals whose behaviors were extreme and disruptive. These were the cases that society couldn't simply ignore. But between 1840 and 1880, the very definition of what constituted mental illness expanded dramatically. The criteria for what could be considered insanity became so broad that almost any deviation from the societal norm could be classified as a disorder in need of treatment. This expansion of diagnostic categories is one of the most striking elements of the asylum boom. Behaviors that would have once been considered eccentric, unusual, or simply a sign of personal difference were now pathologized. Religious enthusiasm, political radicalism, or even simply challenging the social order were all behaviors that could now be classified as mental illnesses. Even homesickness or nostalgia, which had once been a relatively harmless longing for home, became a diagnosable condition that justified institutionalization. New terms like moral insanity and drapetomania were coined to describe behaviors that might seem strange to modern sensibilities but were, at the time, used as rationalizations for institutionalizing individuals who were seen as inconvenient or dangerous. The rise of asylums and the expansion of psychiatric diagnoses during the same period is not coincidental. It suggests a deliberate attempt to control and contain a population that might otherwise have been difficult to govern. People who were not necessarily suffering from mental illness, but who simply had memories or experiences that conflicted with the official story, were now labeled as insane. Those who remembered a different world, a time before the Great Disruption, were categorized as delusional or suffering from false memories, and placed in institutions where their testimony could be suppressed. It is not hard to imagine that many of these people, who might have once had their voices heard, were now silenced under the guise of medical treatment. The diagnostic explosion that occurred between 1840 and 1880 was part of a broader global trend. Asylum construction did not happen in isolation. It was part of a coordinated effort to reshape the world's psychiatric landscape. Just as asylums sprang up across the globe in a coordinated fashion, so too did the diagnostic categories used to justify institutionalization. For example, the rise of the moral insanity diagnosis paralleled the rise of asylums. This vague and expansive category of insanity allowed for almost anyone who didn't fit neatly into the social fabric of the time to be institutionalized. It was a way to control people who posed a threat not because they were violent, but because their memories or their beliefs threatened to disrupt the new narrative that was being constructed. It is also worth noting that many of the diagnoses that emerged during this period seem particularly focused on the idea of historical dislocation. People who were not able to reconcile the changes in their environment with their memories of the past. The patients in these asylums often described a world that no longer existed, a world that had been erased and replaced with a new order. Some patients claimed that the architecture of the cities had changed, that streets had risen and buildings had been buried. They spoke of a time when things were different, when the world looked different. And these patients were not merely confused. They were labeled as mad because they dared to suggest that the official narrative, the story of gradual linear development, was false. They were people who remembered the past, and in doing so, they became the targets of psychiatric institutionalization. One of the most disturbing aspects of this period is how few records remain of these patients. The few that do exist are often fragmented, heavily filtered, and interpreted through the lens of psychiatric diagnosis. The voices of these patients, those who may have held crucial knowledge about the lost world, are almost entirely absent from the historical record. The records that remain often offer little more than vague descriptions of symptoms. There is little to no mention of their lives before they were committed, no acknowledgement of their family connections, and no attempt to understand the real reasons behind their institutionalization. It is as if these people were meant to disappear from history entirely. Even the few surviving patient writings are often dismissed as the products of disturbed minds, and many records were destroyed outright. The deeper one digs into the asylum archives, the more it becomes apparent that the records have been carefully filtered and purged. It is not just that the records are incomplete or vague. Many of them have been deliberately erased. Patient files and personal testimonies were often destroyed as therapeutically counterproductive. In other cases, records were simply lost or damaged, sometimes due to fire or water damage. This destruction of records was not an accident. It was systematic, and it happened at a time when the institutions themselves were being abandoned, as psychiatric care shifted to other models in the 20th century. Why were these records destroyed? And why was there such a concerted effort to prevent the testimony of these patients from surviving into an era when independent researchers might ask questions that were not wanted? It is as though these witnesses, those who might have remembered a different history, had to be erased from the record completely. The systematic destruction of patient records is a glaring anomaly that has been largely ignored by mainstream historical inquiry, yet it offers a crucial clue about the true purpose of the asylums. Asylum records from this period contain disturbing gaps. These gaps reveal a systematic effort to conceal the real story. The records don't just fail to explain the patient's origins, they fail to even acknowledge the contradiction between the rapid growth of asylum populations and the lack of any clear explanation for it. There is no public health investigation into why so many people suddenly needed to be institutionalized. The medical establishment, rather than investigating this phenomenon, simply accepted it as normal. But the sheer scale of this explosion in mental illness, particularly the prevalence of symptoms that seem to indicate confusion about the past and the present, should have raised red flags. Instead, the response was uniform and immediate: commitment, containment, silence. The mentally ill were removed from society, and their testimony was disregarded as delusional. The asylums filled, and the voices of the witnesses became drowned out by the overwhelming force of the new official narrative. And while the world moved on, erasing the memories of those who remembered the past, the asylums themselves remained, monuments to a hidden history that was never allowed to be told.